So I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight. He's Andrew Diemer. He's a professor of history at Towson University, where he's taught African American history since 2011. He received his PhD from Temple. His first book, The Politics of Black Citizenship, Free African Americans in the Mid-Atlantic Borderland, 1817 to 1863, was published by the University of Georgia Press in 2016. Last year, he published Vigilance, The Life of William Still, Father of the Underground Railroad, with Alfred A. Knopf, which the New York Times praised as a compelling new biography written with meticulous care and a jaw-dropping amount of research. Okay, so without further ado, welcome, Andrew.
Thanks. I think I want that quote from the New York Times on my tombstone. Thank you so much for having me here. It's great to be here. I actually live in Philadelphia, but the other side of Center City, so it's fun to come over here and to spend some time in the place where William Still lived so much of his life and did so much of his work. So what I want to do today is think about his life and think about the work that consumes so much of that life. But I want to do so particularly in the context of thinking about this space, right? The geographic spaces in which he worked and lived. We Philadelphians, we do a really good job of remembering our Revolutionary era history. You know, the city spends a lot of money doing this, and people come here to see that history. But these very same places have a longer history as well, right? And I think William Still's life helps us think about how that story continues into the 19th century. And that story is very much a story of African American history as well. So I think that's the way I want to think about this story tonight. So if you will, I want to begin tonight the same way that I begin the book, which is I'd like you to imagine yourself on an August evening in 1850. William Still is sitting at his desk, working, writing, as he does so much of the time. The office where he was working, you see here, is the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society office on North 5th Street, just north of Arch Street. It's not there anymore, unfortunately. The Mint is there now. So we'll have to use our imagination, but Still is seated at his desk, and in walked two men. One of the men Still knew, and one of them was a complete stranger. The stranger introduced himself as Peter Friedman, and he began to explain what had brought him here to Philadelphia. Peter and his brother had been separated from their parents at a very young age, sold by their master south, first to Kentucky, then to Alabama. In Alabama, after years of labor and after the death of his brother, Peter was finally able to purchase his own freedom. Upon doing so, he set out for the North. He set out to look for the family that he had lost all those years before. Unfortunately, he didn't know much about his family. He didn't have much to go on, and he remembered that they had lived in a home near the Delaware River, and so he headed for Philadelphia. William Still listened to all of this with interest, but likely with a bit of skepticism. Not skepticism because he didn't believe the story. This was a story that was not uncommon among Philadelphians, many of whom had been separated by slavery. He was skeptical about the chance that he was going to be able to help Peter recover his family. Nevertheless, he asked Peter to tell him whatever details he did know about his family, and so Peter began. My mother, he said, was named Sidney, and my father was named Levin. All of a sudden, the feeling in the room changed. Still couldn't believe what he was hearing. His own mother had been named Sidney. His own father had been named Levin. It began to dawn on Still that this man sitting across from him, a man he had never seen before, was in fact his long-lost brother. Now, this is surely a remarkable story. This was a story that Still would revisit over and over again. It was a story he told, and he clearly saw it as a central story in his own life. The reason, though, that I begin the book, and I want to begin tonight with this story, is that not only is it remarkable, but it tells us some really important things about William Still and about the work that he did. First off, as miraculous as this story seems, it was no miracle. It was no accident that Peter, he took the name Still, Peter Still walked into his brother's office that day. It was instead the result of the work that William Still was doing. William Still had placed himself at the center of a network of people committed to aiding fugitive slaves, a network that stretched from Georgia to Canada, a network that was already in the 1850s being called the Underground Railroad. It was for this reason only logical that Peter Friedman would come to William Still looking for the information that he needed. So I'm going to think a little bit about that work over the course of this evening. The other thing that this remarkable moment of reunion between these two brothers helps us understand is the centrality of family and of community to the work that William Still did. William Still was born into an abolitionist family. Both of his parents had been enslaved. His mother was, in fact, a fugitive from slavery. William Still grew up, therefore, understanding his own family's connection to slavery and understanding this connection as a commitment to doing something about this. In other words, it was not only when William Still became a professional abolitionist that he had done this work. This was work that he did as a child. He has memories of helping family members escort fugitive slaves into safety in his childhood in southern New Jersey. By the early 1850s, though, this sort of familial commitment to aiding fugitive slaves had become a professional one. Still was the central figure in what was known as the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee. Technically, he was the chair of the acting committee of the Vigilance Committee, which was somewhat larger. This was an organization committed to aiding fugitive slaves by any and all means at their disposal. This position would ultimately involve Still in some of the most dramatic, exciting moments in the antebellum history. I mean, this is Still's connection to some of the most dramatic moments that we can think of in this dramatic moment of conflict between slavery and freedom. I want to consider a few of these dramatic moments in Still's life. Again, I want to consider them not just for the drama, that the drama is great, but I want to consider them for what they can tell us about the work that he did. The first one involves a man named Henry Brown. So Henry Brown was enslaved in Richmond. And in Richmond, his master hired him out to work in a tobacco factory. This was fairly typical of the way that urban slavery in a place like Richmond worked. As was also typical of slavery in this time and place, Brown's wife was owned by a different master, which meant that their children were the property of that other master. And so when that master in 1848 decided to sell Brown's wife and children, it meant that he would be separated from them. Brown has these, he would later recall this horrifying image of coming home from the tobacco factory and seeing his wife and children dragged through the streets in Richmond in chains. It was at this moment that Brown decided to run away. His family was what was holding him in place, preventing him from taking this risk of running away. Now that they had been torn away from him, he decided to take this risk. However, deciding to run away and actually succeeding in doing so are not the same thing. Brown had two advantages, though. First, he had an ingenious plan. Secondly, he had an ally, a white man named Samuel Smith, who was willing to help him execute this plan. And so, with the help of this ally, he had himself sealed into a crate and mailed from Richmond to Philadelphia. Now, this is a famous story. It's a story, though, that would have been almost impossible a decade earlier. A decade earlier, it would have taken days for this crate to travel from Richmond to Philadelphia. The chances of Brown surviving that journey were much less. By 1848, though, things had changed. The transportation infrastructure of this region had expanded, had improved, and so this journey would only take about 24 hours. But it would be an excruciating and nearly deadly 24 hours for Brown. At one point, this crate was turned upside down and he found himself painfully suspended on his neck and shoulder. Nevertheless, the crate eventually arrived in Philadelphia, where an associate of Still and the Vigilance Committee met the crate at the depot and brought it to the anti-slavery office. At which point, Still and a number of other men gathered around, desperately praying that Brown had survived this journey. They knocked, and when they heard him respond, they pried open the top of the crate, and out emerged Henry Brown, ultimately to be forever after known as Henry Box Brown. So, for obvious reasons, Brown was exhausted after this trip. He spent a few days in Philadelphia recuperating, part of it with the Stills at their home, and was then, I show you where, here's the Still home where Brown would have stayed. This is the home on what's now Delhi Street. It was then known as Ronaldson Street. So this is between South Street and Bainbridge, so just north of Palumbo Square, if you know that area. After recuperating for a few days, Brown headed on north via William Still's Underground Railroad network and became a famous abolitionist, telling his story much to the consternation of some more cautious abolitionists. Frederick Douglass would be a critic of this sort of publicity. In any case, this story tells us a lot about how William Still operated. Right? He is not traveling into the South. He is not concocting this plan. This plan is Brown's. This is the Brown is taking the risks. What Still is doing is he's providing a network that makes these courageous plans more likely to succeed. Right? That is Still's job. He is making it possible for something like this to actually have a better chance of succeeding than if there was no network to begin with. I want to move on to a second kind of dramatic moment in Still's life. A couple years later, Still was once again in his office in Philadelphia when he receives word that there were slave catchers about. Now, in 1851, this was important news for Still to get because the year before, the Congress had passed a new strengthened fugitive slave law. This law was in turn a response to the laws that had been passed in places like Pennsylvania that had made it increasingly difficult and sometimes dangerous and expensive for masters to come into states like Pennsylvania and recover fugitive slaves. So what the fugitive slave law essentially did was say that it's no longer the responsibility of states or local governments to return fugitive slaves. That will become the responsibility of a federal bureaucracy that was created. In order to execute this, though, the claimed master needed to come and get a warrant. So that was what had happened. This master had come to Philadelphia looking for a warrant. And when he did this, somebody let it slip and word got to William Still. The master in question was a man named Edward Gorsuch. Not sure that there's any connection to the Supreme Court justice, so it wouldn't surprise me. Edward Gorsuch had received word that there were 4 men he claimed as his property who had fled his farm in Baltimore County and had sought refuge in Christiana, Pennsylvania, so 50 miles west of here. These men, John Beard, Thomas Wilson, Alexander Scott, and Edward Thompson, were living in this Black community in Lancaster County. Still received word that these men were targets. He sent it along his network. And so we see this Underground Railroad network not just carrying people, but carrying information as well. and Still also knew that in Christiana, there was a robust vigilance committee. Thing that I would say here is that thinking about the geography of Still's work, right? We look around us and we think about these places as places where Still is operating, right? He's gathering information. He's using allies as places to hide fugitive slaves. He's hiding fugitive slaves in his own home. This same geography is a geography of slave catching, right? Slave catchers are operating on these same streets. They're looking for the same people who Still is looking to help. Infamously, what we now call Independence Hall is a place where fugitive slave hearings are happening. And so these very same places that we think of in different contexts also have this history of the Underground Railroad and the struggle over fugitive slaves. Which brings us to a final dramatic moment that I want to focus on tonight. This one, once again, begins, you see a pattern here. This begins with William Still sitting at his desk, writing. A boy walks in and places a note on his desk. This is in 1855. A boy walks in and places a note on his desk, which reads the following. Sir, will you come down to Bloodgood's Hotel as soon as possible? There are 3 fugitive slaves here and they want their liberty. Their master is with them on his way to New York. Now, Still knew where Bloodgood's Hotel was. You can see it here. It is right along the wharf. So it's right on Walnut Street. Walnut Street's right here. Another image of it here. So we see this. This is obviously from the river. You can see this is looking straight down Walnut Street. This is Bloodgood's right there. So Still knew the hotel. And he also knew that if this master was indeed on his way to New York, he would likely take a ferry across the Delaware and then get on a train that would take him the rest of the way to New York. And so Still decided that it was important to catch this group before they left Philadelphia, that this was their best chance to make a difference here. And so he headed for the hotel, but before he got there, he stopped in to recruit an ally of his, a man named Passmore Williamson, a white man, actually the only white man on the acting committee of the Vigilance Committee. Still likely presumed that having a white man like Williamson would be an important thing here, that there were certain things that Williamson would be able to do that Still might not be able to do. And so the two of them headed for Bloodgood's Hotel. They arrived there and they received word that the woman in question was gone. She had already gone to the ferry. And so they proceeded down to the wharf, to the ferry, up to the top deck, where they found the woman in question. She was standing there with her 2 sons in front of her. And behind her was the man they presumed was her master. Still would later recall him as a sickly looking white man. They strode up to her, the woman that they later learned was named Jane Johnson, and they informed her that she was free. Legally, by her presence in Pennsylvania, she had become free. Now, there's a little bit of background here, right? So when Pennsylvania had abolished slavery, or I should say began the long, arduous, decades-long process of abolishing slavery, the legislature had included a provision whereby masters could legally bring slaves into the state and maintain legal ownership of them as long as they didn't overstay 6 months. So you may recall that when George Washington was president, he brought enslaved people with him and had to negotiate this. He found loopholes, he would bring them out of the state, et cetera. This provision had been repealed in 1847. So when Pennsylvania passed its law, its personal liberty law that was intended to thwart fugitive slave recovery, it also repealed this 6-month provision, which meant that legally, when this master brought Jane Johnson into the state of Pennsylvania, she became free. Now, this is different than if she were a fugitive slave, right? If she had run away on her own, then this wouldn't have applied. Then the Constitution's fugitive slave clause would apply instead. What still explained to Jane Johnson very quickly here on this top deck of this ship was that legal freedom was not the same as real freedom. Right? It was one thing to say, yes, you are free by merit of being in Pennsylvania. What he wanted her to understand, though, is that this moment could pass. If she left with this master, then there's no guarantee she would have this opportunity again. So even though the law was on her side, she still needed to take the first step. She still needed to take the initiative. And so hearing this, she said to Still, I've always wanted to be free. And she began to walk toward him, at which point the man, her master, a man named Wheeler, grabbed her and attempted to restrain her. It was at this moment when a group of Black men who worked on the docks, who had gathered on the scene, closed in and seized Wheeler and enabled Jane Johnson and her sons to escape with Still. So Still walked them down the stairs to the wharf, into the streets to a waiting carriage, and drove them off into the streets of Philadelphia, ultimately sheltering her at his own home that evening and sending her on the next day. And so, we think about this. This is, again, something to get us thinking about the geography of freedom in Philadelphia. These wharves are places of conflict over freedom, right? They look quite different now, right? A lot has changed here along the waterfront, but there's still an opportunity to think about the water and its connection to the city. This is not the end of the story, though. So Wheeler turned out to be quite an important person. He was actually the minister to the nation of Nicaragua, which at this moment in history was actually a really important position. So in the 1850s, slaveholding politicians had begun to cast greedy eyes upon the Caribbean, Central America. Some of them had ambitions to annex places like Cuba, to make it a slave state, perhaps, certainly to make it slave territory for the United States. At the very least, these slaveholding politicians wanted to make sure that these new nations of Latin America were friendly to slavery. So many of these nations had abolished slavery upon gaining their freedom. These slaveholding politicians wanted to make sure that they didn't stand in the way of imperial ambitions of slaveholding politicians. And so, this is a sort of like pro-slavery diplomacy that's going on, and Wheeler is at the forefront of this. He'd actually dined with the president, Franklin Pierce, at the White House the night before. And so this is a man with connections. As you can imagine, such a man was not going to let this affront to his personal property go unchallenged. He likely realized that Jane was gone. He likely realized that he was not going to be able to recover her, but he certainly wanted the men responsible for her escape to pay. And so ultimately, he brought charges against the men involved, including Still. He accused them of assault and battery. He basically said that they had assaulted him and stolen his property away from him. Ultimately, there was a trial, and a couple of the men paid a smallish fine and served a small amount of jail time. Still was ultimately acquitted. But most importantly, Jane Johnson was never recovered, right? So she was able to take advantage of this moment to gain her freedom. So when we think about this moment, this confrontation on the Delaware River, we think about a few things, right? Once again, we see the importance of intelligence gathering, right? Somebody brought this information to Still. They knew that he was the person to bring this to, that he would know what to do. We also see that Still and the Vigilance Committee are quite sophisticated in navigating the conflict between state and local and federal law, that they're sort of, they understand that law and they understand how they can use it to their advantage. And then most importantly, what this scene reminds us of is the importance of the Black community of Philadelphia to all of this work that Still was doing. It was likely that without the intervention of these Black dockhands, people who were not, officially associated with the abolitionist movement, without their aid in this instance, it's possible that Jane Johnson wouldn't have been able to escape. And so we need to always think about how the Black community of Philadelphia is the bedrock of this, the Underground Railroad and the abolitionist movement more broadly. All right, so these are three kind of big dramatic moments, and hopefully I've used them to illustrate some important things about Still's life, but I want to spend a little time talking about less dramatic stuff. Right? I think we can all agree that no life is simply defined by the most dramatic moments in that life. There's the things that we do every day. Right? We need to think about, we need to come to grips with the things that we do every day to understand someone's life. And as I've said, in each of these instances, what Still is doing at the start of them, he's sitting at his desk. That's what he did most of the time. And most of the time, dramatic things didn't happen, right? Most of the time, his long lost brother didn't walk into his office. So what are we to make of that everyday work that William Still did? And one of the things I really struggle with in this book is trying to bring that stuff to life, to try to explain that these things that seem mundane and everyday are actually really important. It is this everyday work that enables Still to help perhaps 1,000 fugitives from slavery in the 1850s. Many of whom, again, as I said earlier, were sheltered in his home. So we see here, this is where the home I was talking about earlier is. In the mid-1850s, he would open a boarding house here on the 800 block of South Street. There's no plaque there. There should be a plaque there. It's the same block. If you know, there's a plaque for Octavius Catto on that block. I'd like to see a Still plaque there as well. So Still is, through this everyday work, this work of sitting at his desk, recording, writing letters, corresponding with people, is doing this essential work that makes possible these hundreds, perhaps 1,000 people to escape from slavery. Still is in essence a connector. He is a person who connects the far-flung elements of the Underground Railroad. He brings together these, dozens, hundreds perhaps, of people who are committed to the same cause that he was, but through connecting them makes all of their work more effective. Just to talk about a few of these people with whom he is connected, among the most famous of these is a man named Thomas Garrett from Wilmington, Delaware, very close associate of his. William Whipper of Lancaster County, a lumber dealer, also an important part of Still's network. These were some of the many people who would send fugitive slaves to Still in Philadelphia, right? They would end up in Lancaster County by whatever means, maybe running, maybe finding some other way there. Whipper would often put them on a train and they would come to Philadelphia. This required lots of coordination, right? They come by train to Philadelphia. They're going to end up at a train station. I think I have an image of, here's a train station that was at Broad in Washington. Incidentally, just thinking about the geography of Philadelphia, right? We're now accustomed to thinking about all the trains coming into the same place. Not the case in the 19th century. Like each different train line would come into a different station. Train stations were perhaps the most dangerous place that fugitive slaves could be, right? Arriving on a train, looking around, not knowing where the next place you were supposed to go is a very vulnerable place to be. This is exactly where slave catchers would be looking for you. And so it was very important that Still have advance word of when people were arriving so that he or an associate would be there to greet and make sure this person was safe. Some of that communication was done by writing. Increasingly, as the 1850s went on, this communication was done by this new medium of the telegraph. So he was able to communicate much more efficiently and rapidly via this new technology. Still also had connections with ship captains. So ship captains who sailed into Philadelphia. Some of these captains sailing out of southern ports were willing to smuggle fugitive slaves aboard their ships. And so still needed to have communication with them to know when this was going to be happening. This practice of smuggling fugitive slaves was common enough that the state of North Carolina actually instituted a policy known as smoking, which meant that before ships were allowed to leave port, they had to be infused with noxious smoke as a way of driving out fugitive slaves who might be hidden in some secret place on board the ship. Others attempted to duplicate Henry Brown's feat of sealing himself into a box, some with less success than Brown. Others simply arrived. And there's a kind of surprising number of people who just kind of show up at Still's home or his office looking for help. Often they're brought to him by people in the community who know him and know he is the person to help. Again, we want to think about the geography of Black Philadelphia. Fugitive slaves show up in a city like Philadelphia. They are looking for people they can trust. They don't know who they can trust. They are unlikely to trust white people for obvious reasons. And so Still's sort of network throughout the Black community of Philadelphia helps funnel people towards him. When these fugitive slaves arrived, Still would take on the responsibility of providing them with food, medical care, sometimes new clothes, sometimes a shave and a haircut, right? This again, seems mundane, but given the fact that these folks in many cases had been on the road for weeks, sometimes months, given the fact that their next step was going to take them on a train, most likely to New York, it was imperative that they not look like fugitive slaves. And so these kind of simple things of making them look presentable, helping them blend in so that they wouldn't stand out as fugitive slaves, are really an important part of Still's work. All of that, of course, cost money. And it was Still's responsibility to raise that money. Sometimes it happened locally. So there were meetings held often in Black churches where people would come, and sometimes there were speakers, and they would contribute money to fund the Vigilance Committee. Sometimes this was done far away. So there's a significant amount of money that goes towards the Vigilance Committee from Great Britain, from British abolitionists, many of whom are sympathetic to the plight of fugitive slaves. In any case, Still had to account for all the money that was coming in and that was being spent. Quite often, vigilance committees were accused of squandering money. Sometimes people in Still's position were accused of embezzling that money. And Still's records, we see some of these records here, in part were an effort to account for that money. But on a less personal level, making it clear that you are spending money wisely is a way of encouraging people to give more of that money. And so Still makes it clear that people are welcome to, people of goodwill, right? Allies are welcome to come and inspect his books because he wants them to know that if you give him money, he can be trusted with it. So that's one reason why we see these records that have been left to us, really perhaps the most remarkable and important records that we have of the workings of the Underground Railroad. The second reason, though, is a little bit more personal. So I started tonight with the story of the reconciliation of Peter and William Still. Having experienced that, Still realized that slavery had torn people apart all over America, and that running away often meant leaving behind family members. He also hoped that his records would provide some means of at least some of those families reconciling in the future. And so we look at the details. They're not just about money spent. They're also descriptions of people, where they came from, sometimes where they're going, all of this is intended to help bring families back together, bring loved ones back together in the future. Now, given all of this work, given the fact that Still was sheltering fugitive slaves in his own home, bringing his home work with him, as it were, there was no real dividing line between the domestic Still and the professional Still, which meant that his wife, Letitia Still, was an integral part of the work that Still did, whether it be at the house on Ronaldson Street or the boarding house on South Street. It's harder to get at what Letitia Still did, but we know that she was sometimes there when fugitive slaves arrived. Sometimes William wasn't there, and so she had to take the lead on making sure that they were safe. We also know that in letters written back to William Still, sometimes years later, recalling his work in aiding people escaping from slavery, thanking him for that work, over and over again, they talk about Letitia Still. Over and over again, they talk about how welcoming she had been. They talk about the Still children, who were quite young at this time. Now, again, we need to remember that for many fugitive slaves, running away meant leaving your family behind. And so we can imagine fugitive slaves who may have left their own wife and children behind in bondage to have even an evening, even a night with this Still family was really meaningful, and they write about this over and over again in their letters. So all of this work, of course, involved some level of secrecy, right? Some of this had to be done out of prying eyes. Still was always on the lookout for slave catchers, but to a surprising extent, Still was also a public figure, even going as far as to talk publicly and to write publicly about the work he was doing aiding fugitive slaves. In the 1850s, as he's helping fugitive slaves escape, he is writing to the newspaper and talking about doing so, right? Saying, last week aided, X, Y, and Z folks. Now, he always had to leave out details, right? The details were slim in these articles, but we might ask, why talk about this at all, right? Why publicize this at all? And here I think there are a couple reasons. One comes back to money, right? If you're asking people for money to do something, you need to make sure that they know the work that you're doing. And so publicizing the work of aiding fugitive slaves was in part a way of getting people to contribute money to continue that work. The other thing I think is comes back to the context of this time. So we know, right, with the benefit of hindsight, that just a few years down the road, we're going to have a civil war, we're going to have a 13th Amendment, we're going to have the end of slavery. In the 1850s, nobody knew that, right? And in many ways, when abolitionists looked around them in the 1850s, things were getting worse. Right, the so-called slave power was winning. They were expanding into what had assumed to be the free territory of Kansas. We have this, unprecedented decision by the Supreme Court, the Dred Scott decision. All of this is disheartening to abolitionists. And so one of the things that Still is doing in publicizing the work that he is doing is lifting the spirits of abolitionists, right? Things look bad, things aren't going our way, but we are making a difference, right? It is possible to challenge slavery and to actually win. I think that is also a message of the publicity that Still is giving to the work that he's doing. Now, once the Civil War was over and once the 13th Amendment has been passed, Still begins to tell these stories in a more public and a more complete way. And he becomes a kind of official storyteller of the Underground Railroad. But in doing so, Still wants to get the story right. Already, by the late 1860s, there has begun to emerge a version of the Underground Railroad that highlights what we might call white benevolence, right? That places the center of the story of the Underground Railroad on white station masters, so-called, many of them Quakers, who opened their homes courageously to fugitive slaves. In this telling, fugitive slaves themselves are basically helpless beneficiaries of this white benevolence. Now, Still was never one to slight the contribution of his white allies. As we saw earlier, Thomas Garrett was a close ally, the Motts, lots of Passmore Williamson. Passmore Williamson already mentioned, close allies, and he always gave them their due, but he also knew that was not the whole story. That wasn't even the most important part of the story. So ultimately, what Still wanted to do was to tell his story, and the fruits of that story would ultimately be his book, The Underground Railroad. 800 pages of dramatic stories, letters, documents, telling this rich story of hundreds of fugitives from slavery. Incidentally, this is the house, the Still home. It's not actually his home, but the place where his home was that does have the plaque on 12th Street. This is where he lived when he wrote this book. So that was not a fugitive slave. That was not an Underground Railroad site. That was a site of the writing of the Underground Railroad. In this book, Still makes it clear that the story of the Underground Railroad is not the story of a dramatic few, but it is instead the story of hundreds of remarkable Black women, children, and men fleeing from slavery via their own ingenuity, courageous persistence. I mean, it's a book that places the emphasis on the remarkable character of fugitive slaves themselves. That's by design. When we think about the context in which this book was written, the 1870s are a moment where Americans are wrestling with what is the future of African Americans. Even some of those who had been opposed to slavery by the early 1870s were thinking that maybe Black people are not ready for citizenship. And so in writing this book and emphasizing the character, the remarkable achievements of this group of hundreds of fugitives from slavery, Still is making a statement about the suitability of African Americans for citizenship. So he highlights the Black contribution to the Underground Railroad, but he also really wants the emphasis to be on the fugitives themselves. In his book, I think we might say that, to borrow the language of the Underground Railroad, he makes them the agents in their own emancipation. Or we might even go further and to say they were the Underground Railroad. Right? In other words, fugitives from slavery did not ride on the Underground Railroad. They were the Underground Railroad. They embodied the Underground Railroad. I think, therefore, the book is not only a remarkable document about the lives of fugitive slaves, it is also a fitting tribute to Still's own story. Still's story was, by his own telling, the story not of a heroic lone individual saving people by himself, but it instead was the story of that remarkable person's role in a community struggle, in a struggle that Still always understood as bigger than his own story. So thank you. And I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Yeah, in reading about the period, how Craig Douglas's comments about Philadelphia finding it just such fits into this story.
Yeah, so I mean, Douglas always and I actually things about Philadelphia and there's like Frederick Douglass. And I think that comes into play here when we think of counterforce where on a certain level, some people have begun to change their mind. There's been a growing sympathy for fugitive slaves in the 1850s, certainly unlike what we were seeing in the 1840s. But I think most importantly, to come back to a theme that I was talking about earlier, which is the importance of the Black community, what we also see in the 1850s, and this is not unique in Philadelphia, we see it all across the North, is a more aggressive, more confrontational attitude from Black people in general, who are more publicly and more kind of vocally saying, we will defend ourselves. So when we see, where we would have seen mobs in the 1840s attacking Black people and white abolitionists, in the 1850s, when there are fugitive slave hearings, there are actually mobs of African Americans outside. We wouldn't even call them mobs, right? They're crowds of African Americans basically demonstrating, saying, we are here and we're prepared to defend the people who are being put on trial as fugitive slaves. That's a really important change. And I think, so that's, I guess, my answer to that, right? So we have begun to see that change. Again, I don't want to overstate this, right? This is still quite a hostile place. But I do think things have begun to change by the 1850s.
The planters from the south that came up here and established Gettysburg, like Carolina Railroad, did they bring slaves with them in Philadelphia? How did that work?
So it became, so after 1847, it was increasingly perilous for them to do so. I think what we see is that some of them found loopholes. So I think what Wheeler was trying to do, he understood the legal consequences of bringing Jane Johnson to Philadelphia. What he was hoping was, so she had other children who weren't with her that she would be leaving behind. And he reminded her, you don't want to leave your family. And so sometimes they would bring slaves with them and try to use these kinds of like soft methods of coercion, knowing that the law wasn't on their side, that if they ran away, there was no legal recourse to do something about it. So I guess after 1847, fewer and fewer were willing to do that, but some were certainly willing to take that risk.
You mentioned Wheeler's involvement with the government, for example, Nigeria.
Nicaragua.
How could negotiations there be a help to them since the importation of slavery was stopped by the Constitution?
Yeah, so it was less about the slave trade and it was more about the continuing practice of slavery. So lots of planters from the United States actually owned plantations in Cuba. So even though Cuba was not American territory, they owned plantations in Cuba. There were, what were called filibusters who were hoping to actually, occupy Nicaragua, other places. So there were, what's that?
Spanish West Florida.
Yeah, I mean, so this was a sort of, slavery was a kind of global system, even if it wasn't about importing slaves into the United States. Though I should mention that there was illegal importation of slaves going on in this period all the way up to the Civil War. So it was less, but I think this pro-slavery diplomacy was less about the slave trade and more about the idea that there were, that's right, there were still economic opportunities in the Caribbean for slaveholders.
So I have a sense that he got a lot of his money from coal handling and debt, and then I'm wondering in relation to that there's a certain point where from that point on, he's just getting his money from the cost, basically.
So the coal business is sort of is later. So I've sort of focused on the 1850s part of his life, the Underground Railroad part. So once we get into the Civil War, he actually resigns his position at the Anti-Slavery Society. He feels like things are changing. It's time for him to earn some more money and provide for his family in a better way. That's when he gets into the coal business. He actually, he begins as I think he wants to open a stove store with a sideline in coal, and then he makes so much money in coal that he decides to focus on the coal. So that's sort of the 60s on.
Excuse me, you think that he knew Stephen Smith and he was involved with him, teaching him maybe how to be in the coal and lumber industry? Because, I mean, William didn't really know anything about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's an interesting question whether, I mean, so he certainly had this relationship with Smith on the Underground Railroad prior to his involvement in business. And so I don't have any direct evidence that Smith sort of like gave him advice on how to operate his business, but that certainly is plausible and almost certain that they talked about business, they talked about this. The extent of that advice, I don't know, but I think certainly it's likely that there was some sort of advice coming from Smith and Whipper, who were both successful businessmen.
The big partnership.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Hey, how about, did you see David Blake's book about Fred, where William brought Fred and John Brown?
That's
and
right.
Come on, one more. Fred, John Brown, William Still, come on, there's one more. Stephen Smith.
It's
They
Stephen
all
Smith.
met there on 9th Street.
That's right.
You see that story?
Yes, absolutely. I talk about it in the book. So, so just to kind of expand on this, John Brown, as he was developing his plan to assault Harper's Ferry, was looking for allies and he was looking for advice, right? And he was looking for money, you know. So Smith at that point still was not, you know, capable of committing that much money, but certainly he had expertise. And certainly John Brown would have liked all of these Black abolitionists from Philadelphia to join in this raid on Harper's Ferry. None of them did, but and in fact, you know, still, I mean, they all admired John Brown. John Brown had the admiration of all of these abolitionists, but I think many of them felt like this plan wasn't likely to accomplish much of anything. But they certainly met with him and they offered advice. Again, the extent of that advice is hard to know, but certainly they had some role. And, you know, when John Brown is apprehended at Harper's Ferry, Still's name and address is on one of his chief lieutenants. And so Still is implicated, whether or not, you know, depending on, we don't really know how much he actually contributed, but he certainly was implicated in the raid on Harper's Ferry.
How you got into this?
Yeah, so I wrote an earlier book, which was a more academic kind of book about the struggle for citizenship rights by Black communities, both in Philadelphia and Baltimore. And so it was looking at this kind of long struggle between the 18 teens and the Civil War. And in the Philadelphia part of it, as I was researching that, I kept coming across William Still, who was this person I was familiar with. I knew who he was, but I didn't know too much about him. But he kept showing up in unexpected ways in that research. I've talked a little bit about this tonight, about Still the public man, the man writing to newspapers. He's making speeches, he's serving on public committees. And all of this didn't seem to fit with what I thought I knew about the Underground Railroad. And so when it came time to turn to this second book, I was really intrigued by that. And so I wanted to understand, how can we reconcile this public and this secretive Still? And then, you know, the more that I dug, the more fascinating I found Still, and that was ultimately how I ended up writing the book.
I don't mean we can be done, but William Still had with Cave Sutler for Camp William Penn. You hear that story? That
Absolutely.
Mysteriously caught on fire.
Yeah, you know, so they brought him in because I think he had this reputation for being very honest and being a good businessman. They thought they could straighten out. And then, yeah, so it was burned down. So in the book, I don't really have a good explanation of what's going on there. There's some accusations made against him that he wasn't accepting money because it was counterfeited. I think, as not to generalize, but I think soldiers tend to resent these sutlers, right? They tend to think they're being ripped off, so it really didn't matter. So I think on a certain level, it's not really about Still. But there may have been some resentment that here was this guy who was fairly well-to-do at that point, or at least was more prosperous, coming in and profiting off of them. But yeah, there's a little bit of tension there. There's the other story where he brings his brother into the sutler operation as an assistant, and he ends up in court. He's taking old clothes from soldiers and selling it illegally, and so it's really embarrassing for Still. Family can sometimes. What's that? That was not Peter. No, so he's a part of a huge family, 14 children. So this was, I forget the name. I have to. John Still. Maybe it was John Still. That's right.
Well, I
Family.
wanted to ask you about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 versus, you mentioned, personal liberty laws in
Mhm.
Pennsylvania. And you said still managed to navigate that.
Mhm.
But was he breaking the law by what it was doing? And if so, how did he manage to do it so long and well?
Yep.
And partly publicly?
So he definitely was breaking the law. And he definitely was known to be breaking the law. And so this is a question that I think this comes up all the time. And I think the answer is, in part, it comes back to what I was saying earlier, that by the 1850s, the sort of climate had changed a little bit in Philadelphia, that people were a little bit less hostile to the work that he was doing. So the way that the fugitive slave law worked is it was often policemen who were sort of working in an entrepreneurial way, right? They're on their spare time, they would get paid by people to go catch slaves. There were certainly pro-slavery policemen who were willing to do this kind of work. There were also policemen who were not sympathetic to that, so still had allies who were willing to stand up for him. But ultimately, I think it also tells us a little bit about the failures of the fugitive slave law, right? I think we know that it's sort of there as this looming threat, but even though there is this sort of federal infrastructure that's being created to recover fugitive slaves, there are still lots of ways that local government is throwing up barriers to this work. And there are a lot of ways that the people still have power to thwart it. So I guess that's it, so that it's Philadelphians who, the community that still has cultivated in Philadelphia is ultimately making it possible for him to do this work semi-publicly. He wasn't. So he was a Presbyterian. I should say this. So he certainly was affiliated in that he worked with them. They were a place that fugitive slaves sought refuge. He attended meetings that raised money at Bethel for the cause, but he was not a member of that church.
Some of your research comes from Charles Blockson.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the Blockson, as historians, we love letters, right? We love, it's one thing to see these public documents, but it's another thing to be able to read letters written by people. There are huge numbers of letters that he wrote because, as I talked about, his life work is essentially writing letters, right? So a lot of those professional work letters are collected. They're at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. But what you don't see in those letters are the personal still. And that was one of the things I really wanted to try to bring out in this story, is not just this is what this guy did for a living, but who was he? What kind of a person was he? And that's where those Blockson letters come in. So those Blockson letters are letters that Still wrote to his daughters and got from his daughters. One of the problems with a guy like William Still is he lives his whole life in Philadelphia. He doesn't travel a lot, which means he's not writing personal letters to family members because they're eating dinner together or whatever. But his daughters went away to college. They went to Oberlin. And in those years when they were away, we have this wonderful correspondence between father and daughters. And especially with his older daughter, Caroline, it's pretty clear he had a very close relationship. She ended up being a physician. She continued some of the philanthropic work that William had done during his life. There's a clear connection between them. And to me, that's the beautiful thing that comes out of those letters, is that we see some of that private Still that we don't see on display. He's a kind of reserved person in public, right? He's very interested in respectability and looking proper. And in part, he's trying to overcome being poorly educated. He wants to demonstrate this respectability. In those letters, I think we see that private Still that we often don't see. Say that again.
The Christiana right.
Yeah, so that's Still is a part of that as well, right? He sends the word to this community in Christiana. They're able to rise up and fight off this slave catching posse.
Of course, it's family.
Yeah.
Also, said anything about how and when and where got read and write.
Yeah, so very limited very limited formal education for Still. So he grew up in rural South Jersey. There was a school, but he didn't go very often. So his family was a farming family, and most of the year his father needed him around either to work on their farm, to work on other farms. They often gathered berries and things to support the family. But when it was possible, they would sometimes attend. But what they found was that that school was kind of hostile to the Still children. Eventually, Levin Still, William's father, pulled his children out because he felt like the white schoolmaster was essentially like abusive of his children. And so over the course of his childhood, he gets maybe a few months of formal schooling. And so, he learns to read, he teaches himself. He's an autodidact, he is a self-taught man. He looks for every opportunity to read. And then ultimately he gets this job that, is about writing. And I think that's ultimately what makes him the person who's able to write that book, is that he has this sort of professional experience that ultimately gives him these skills that he didn't get in formal schooling. Sure. Yeah. So their escape comes very early in his story when he was just beginning to do this work, but they too, I think, stayed in the Still household, if I'm remembering correctly. So yeah, they're in there as well. Definitely a remarkable story. A new book, there is a book about them specifically. I'm forgetting the name of it. That just came out. Really, really great book.
So did he interact with Lucretia Mott at all?
Yes, definitely. So Lucretia and James Mott were both kind of central figures in the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society itself. So he was technically an employee of that Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. So he did lots of work at their office, but he also did this Underground Railroad work. So that the connection between the Vigilance Committee and the Anti-Slavery Society was kind of tenuous. That there was some money occasionally that would go from the Anti-Slavery Society, but mainly they employed Still, right? So his regular salary came from them. So he certainly had a close association with them.
One question about the end of his life. Did you ever hear of the old folks home?
Yes, yeah.
So eventually, after Stephen Smith died.
That's right.
William Still
became the president. Yep.
Definitely became leader.
Yep. Yeah. So that was, he had a few different philanthropic causes, but that became the most important one, the one closest to his heart, the one that he spent the most of his time and money on. I think Caroline, his daughter, would actually ultimately step into his place when he died. But, to add another thing, we were talking about this, someone was asking about whether there was a sculpture of him. At the end of his life, there was a sculpture made of him in his honor to be displayed at that home, at the old folks' home, that no one knows where it is. So if you ever come across a bust of William Still somewhere.
Well, actually, I live on the property.
Yeah. Well, I think it's not, I think it.
44 from Belmont.
Yeah.
Belmont and Durant. Yeah. Northfield.
No, this is out there.
Oh, okay.
They turned it into Naples. It used to be a big.
Oh, yeah.
The Odd Fellows. I just thought that I would end up there one day.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Oh, okay. All right, so I'm just going to have a really brief meeting. First of all, Mary Ann, as you know, is not here. Keep her in your thoughts and prayers. She is with her mother, who is not doing very well. So, keep her in your thoughts. Also, you might have noticed that Bob Levitt was here and then disappeared. He had gallbladder surgery and has had some issues. So, we wish him well too. Saturday morning, 9 a.m. In the IVC, I'm going to have a brief meeting about the Sicily trip, which is the World Federation of Tourist Guides. A number of people have shown an interest in it. It's to be held in Sicily next January. I'd love for us to have a really strong showing to it. Plus, it's an amazing opportunity and a really great price. So even if you're only, like vaguely contemplating it, I mean, it is all the way till January 2024, but we're going to have a quick little meeting about it for anyone who can make it. And if you can't make it, just, email me or whatever. And if you have any questions about it, because the registration process is a little wonky, but the 28th, there's a tour of the 7th Ward. All this stuff has been put out in Constant Contact. So, Mike, I think you're taking the reservations for that. July 8th, we have a trip planned to the Dickinson Plantation in Dover, Delaware. We have 2 people who are leaving from Center City who are driving. I will be the 3rd if needed. So we already have a nice group. I just got 3 more people emailed me. She's breaking up the joint. So again, I will keep advertising this through June. At some point though, I need to give this woman a count. So I'll probably give her, have some kind of deadline for us all to say if you're going to go or not. All right. But we still have room in cars. Again, I know a lot of people living in Center City, you don't have transportation. Okay. Mike is also leaving from Wayne. I don't expect anybody to drive out to Wayne. And of course, I live in South Jersey. So if anybody wants to go with me from South Jersey, but I do intend to come in here just to have a 3rd car if need be. Okay. I guess that's about it. Our next meeting is the 12th of July. Yes, Joe.
The 7th Ward tour, who's leading it? How much it cost?
It's $20, right, Mike? And it's being led. Do you want to talk about that? I'm not sure.
Sure, it's Michael Johnson.
Oh, right.
Last year.
Right,
It cost us $25 a day.
right.
10 a.m.
Mother Bethel. Yeah. Okay.
About 2 hours.
Yeah. All right. Anybody have any other announcements?
Oh, yeah, that's right. It's the 30th anniversary of the Valley Forge Monument to the African Patriots.
Okay.
So that'll be happening. There's a little a reception afterwards. So it's about 10 o'clock in the morning, very early. So there's a little reception about 12 noon in the at the visitor center area. And of course, they got a brand new movie. I don't know if you've seen the movie yet.
I've seen you in it, Joe. That's right. That 10-second of stardom, but I saw you. Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay. Well, if that's it, thanks for coming out. Thanks for the Zoom people zooming in, and have a good rest of your week.